On this question of the morality of capitalism, of course, these days, my goodness, maybe the bulk of objections to capitalism these days come down to moral arguments. I don't know. It's hard to say. There are so many practical issues involved too, but morality is a huge one. And let's not mistake the fact that the opponents of capitalism are ubiquitous these days. I find it just astonishing how I don't know if it's been the economic recession has unleashed it, or it was always present and now it's more pervasive than ever. But in my lifetime, I've seen two things dramatically change. One is the number of people who are interested in free market theory and the freedom philosophy, generally speaking, and the size of what we call our movement. On the one hand, on the other hand, the forces of anti-capitalism are growing and ever more powerful all the time. I was just picked up a copy of Scientific American. I like to read it, and I was reading through it, and a few editorials and an article or two. And one thing I noticed is very puzzling about everything I read in this issue of the magazine is there seems to be a presumption pervasive throughout the whole issue that the internal combustion engine is thoroughly evil, and that mankind can only progress insofar as we can get rid of oil and gasoline, and this whole process of refineries and all that's associated with it. And it's just bizarre, really. It's never really justified. It's just presumed. And I think to some extent that's what we've come down to into our culture, is that there's something deeply wrong with economic development, with expanding populations, with expanding prosperity. And there seems to be an enormous effort, hardly ever really questioned, to shut it all down. And it's a little bit mystifying to me. I don't entirely understand it. Now, of course, part of the title of this topic is the morality of capitalism. And anytime you say the word capitalism, it introduces problems. I know my friend Sheldon Richmond has just simply stopped using the term. And I'm sure this has been debated here this week. Should we say capitalism? Should we not? Whatever. But I really don't care what you call free markets. I sort of personally like the idea of the term capitalism for various reasons I'd be glad to spell out. But I don't really care what you call it. If you want to call it a banana, that's fine. Capitalism, whatever you want to call it, free markets, the freed market. There's all these proposals out there. I would like to begin this lecture, and by the way, this lecture sort of ties in with the second lecture on critiques of traditionalist attacks on the market. So it's going to be kind of one big lecture. So I would like to begin both, really, by kind of laying out for you what I consider, from my reading of Menger and Mises and Hayek and Rothbard, the three pillars of the market economy, or rather, the three social forces that comprise the engine of the market. And I think it would be useful for you to think about this, and probably some other speakers have gone over this, but I would just like to lay it out for you in a way that's as clear as possible, so that we understand what is and isn't capitalism. For example, I have lots of friends who are dedicated socialists, and they'll come to me and say, well, I understand you're an advocate of capitalism. I'll say, yeah, that's right. They say, well, I think it's disgusting the way the World Bank, funds these large corporations to go into the third world, and in one case, send in the police to round up all the peasants and ship them in buses across to another community entirely so they can open up a big factory on what was otherwise a beautiful beach or whatever. They'll tell some story like that. And so I just sit there thinking, why is it presumed that I'm for this? So it's very simple. I say, well, okay, I'm against that. I'm against that thing that you just said. And there's whole books on these, just kind of marching through various horrors of alleged capitalism that have nothing to do with capitalism whatsoever. So this is why I'd like to spell out for you what I see the main social forces of capitalism. If it falls outside these three areas that I'm going to lay out, it's not capitalism. The first one is cooperation. I'll just mention the next two. The second one is emulation, and the third one is competition. But let's talk first about cooperation. Cooperation is the core value of the market. This involves making deals with other people, working well, and playing with others, as they used to call it in grade school. It means the capacity to work with others to a mutually profitable purpose. I was at the store the other day, and I bought some rolls, and I said, I gave the lady my money, and she gave me my rolls, and I said, thank you, and she said, you're welcome. And I walked away, and I thought, man, there's something wrong with the word you're welcome in that context. You're welcome? Don't you usually say thank you back? I thought, yeah, she shouldn't have said you're welcome. She should have said thank you. Thank you, thank you. It's a very interesting thing what we do in exchange. It's like a mutual gift, you know? You go to a birthday party and you give somebody a gift, they say thank you, you say, well, you're certainly welcome, right? But in economic exchange, it's even better because one person says thank you, the other one says thank you back, because you've both given each other a gift of value. So I valued the bread more than I valued the money I paid for it. She, as a proxy for the management of the store, presumably valued my money more than she valued the bread. So we both end this exchange better off. It's an unequal exchange in the sense that we're not trading equivalent values back and forth. Just by the very act of trading alone, we've increased our well-being as people, as individuals. That's, to me, an extraordinary thing, that the market is based fundamentally on this idea of mutual beneficence, gift-giving, always gift-giving. That's what an exchange is. It wasn't entirely obvious to the ancient writers on the subject of markets that this is what's going on in exchange. If you read Aristotle, for example, you always run across this thing about equivalent value. When is trade just? Well, when people are trading equivalent things. I trade this and you trade that, and it's equal. But do you see why it would be sort of pointless to trade something of equal value? There's no point in doing it. It's a cost. It takes time. You know, you have to kind of go through the hassle. Why would you trade something of equal value? It doesn't make any sense. And I don't know how many of you have read the Pope's recent encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, something like that. It's a beautiful document, and this is a brilliant man, Benedict XVI. A brilliant man. Ratzinger. I used to read him before he was Pope. But he makes a mistake in that document when he talks about equivalence and exchange. I'm quite certain he got the idea from Aristotle. He says exchange is just when people are exchanging things of equivalent value. Well, there's an error. And this error really leads him to underappreciate the role of exchange and its contribution to society generally. Because if you think that all the buying and selling going on every second of the day all over the world involving billions and billions of people is just a bunch of shuffling around, stuff moving here, stuff moving there, it's not really accomplishing anything, you know. Just people shifting stuff all over the place. If you believe that, then you don't really have a very great appreciation for the market. But if you understand that in every exchange, there's an increase in human well-being, that I value one thing, the thing that I'm acquiring, more than the thing I'm giving up, and the reverse is true for the person with whom I'm exchanging, then you understand that exchange alone, just exchange, is a source of wealth in society. And it's magic. To me, it's a wonderful thing that this could go on. It's a beautiful human institution. So just encouraging exchange and cooperation. And part of cooperation, of course, is, 2, working with others to accomplish larger goals. So an aspect of cooperation is specialization and the division of labor. That doesn't mean that any time you put human beings together, they will cooperate. They may not. You know, you're alone on a desert island. You've been, living off berries and whatever fish you could catch. Some other guy shows up. You could look at the other guy as an asset and say, wow, we could work together to improve our well-being. Maybe get more fish, more berries. Thank goodness somebody else is here to help me. I can cooperate with him. Or you could look at him and say, that's an enemy. I'm going to take this guy out. And you're going to fight, right? Not going to trade, you're going to fight. Now, if these two guys fight, what's going to be the result? They're both going to be worse off. You'd like to think that they would discover this early on, right? But human beings don't always discover this, that fighting is actually bad for you, that it's bad for society, that you're far better off cooperating. Most of the time, if given enough time to think about it, people do figure out that cooperation is a good thing. So part of a moral society is a cooperating society. So anything we can do to encourage human cooperation, division of labor, working for other people, exchanging, that's all to the good. The second social force that's part of the market economy or the capitalist structure is an extremely important one. I think the writer who's best on this topic is actually F.A. Hayek. And the topic, it concerns emulation. Emulation. How many have heard that term, emulation? Okay, so it's, yeah, okay. It just means really to copy, to imitate, to appropriate behaviors of others when they're successful. This is absolutely essential for the market economy because it permits us to learn from others' mistakes and learn from other people's failures. If we had to learn all of this on our own, from mistakes and successes, I should say, if we had to learn all things on our own, we wouldn't get very far. So in a growing dynamic society, actually in every society, we have to learn from other people, from what other people are doing. We watch, we look, watch to find what's successful. Two people on an island, one's looking at the way another person is doing the getting berries off the tree or catching fish. We learn from the productive techniques of others. We learn from others when we go to work for them. At a young age, we're constantly being mentored. This is an essential part of the market. So from the market and operation, we find things to emulate. We find things that we want to appropriate for ourselves. And there's something, I mentioned there's something magical and wonderful and mysterious and beautiful to me about the institution of economic exchange. Similarly true with the institution of emulation, because the behaviors of others, the successes of others, learning from the failures of others, this is all free information. It's given to us as a free good. We can take it. Take all of it we want. We can extract information from around us all the time. There's no price to it. We learn. We're constantly learning. And the great thing is we can appropriate that information for ourselves without taking it from other people. So it's not robbery. It's not stealing. It's just appropriating it. Maybe appropriation isn't the right word. It's just emulation. It's just copying. And copying isn't theft. It's just a way of absorbing things onto ourselves, this zero-priced information. It's all in the attitude you take towards it. And I think actually you learn this very early as a child. My daughter came home from school one day, and she said to me, Daddy, I'm very, very upset at my friend so-and-so, Stephanie, or whatever. I said, why? She said, well, yesterday I wore a scarf to school. I arrived today at school, and Stephanie is wearing a scarf. She stole my idea. And, it's funny. I said, well, did she prevent you from wearing a scarf too? No. I said, so you wore a scarf again today? Yeah. So you were both wearing scarves. Right. I said, well, one way to look at that is that you've made a marvelous difference in the world. Before you wore that scarf, nobody was wearing a scarf. But you wore it and got a lot of praise and compliments for it, and you felt special. And she observed that and copied you. And now look what you've done. Because of your behaviors and the things you've done, you've made a dent in the universe. You've changed your little society at your school for the better. Without you, things would be completely different. Doesn't that make you feel important and special? She said, oh yeah, you're right. My goodness. I said, well, can you think of other things you might do to inspire other people to copy you? She said, yeah, I'll put my mind to that right away, right? So then there's a series of hats and, socks and all kind of things, And she would look for ways, look to see if people were copying her as a way of affirming whether or not she was doing the right thing. Do you see it's a matter of attitude? It's all a matter of attitude. And a society of copying, a society of emulation is a growing society, a society that's ever more successful. It's an essential part of the market. You all remember your first job. It was a learning experience, always. You learn the ethic of work, you learn the techniques, always from somebody else. If you had to do that all on your own, you probably wouldn't have gotten very far. isolated, without information from the outside world, we would all be terrible failures. But within a vibrant, free society where we're free to learn from other people, then we can always progress. This is the essence, in a way, of entrepreneurship, because you look for successful things going on in society, and you emulate those, and then you try to improve them just slightly. Try to find some way to make it even better. If you had to do the whole thing by yourself, you wouldn't get anywhere. You think about, maybe some of you have written software. Imagine if you had to start from scratch always, every time, and you had nothing to copy, nothing that you could imitate. You wouldn't get very far. So the development of civilization, the advance of society, really is a series of emulative behaviors that are slightly improved and then tested again. What's that sound? How could it be? Put it in the planter, right. Okay, that's the second force, emulation. The third one, competition, and this is where it gets really fun. First, you learn how to cooperate, then you learn how to imitate, and then you can compete. And this is the part that we most commonly associated with market economics, competition. And that's a good thing. I'll never forget, Dr. Reed, the definition of competition you gave me at that lecture you gave at Howard Payne. You said competition is striving for excellence in the service of others. Do you remember that? Do you still use that? Boy, that stuck. That stuck all these years. Striving for excellence in the service of others. Have you heard that this week? It's a wonder. Memorize it. It's a good thing. Because when people ask you, what do you mean by competition? You say, well, it just means striving for excellence. Excellence in the service of others. Because in the market, of course, you can't compete without serving other people. Something often forgotten. I do also want to emphasize here that within the market economy, business interests aren't always interested in competition. In fact, they almost always prefer to do without it, without a competitive. Well, let's just say the dominant player in a market is not interested in having any competition whatsoever. And there you have the origins of antitrust laws, for example. It's attempting to stop competition. Business isn't always interested in competition. You might want competition, the opportunity to compete if you're on the lower end. If you're just now getting started, you want an opportunity to compete. But once you've taken over a certain sector, you have an incentive to want to shut down competition. Just the other day, for the first time, I read a marvelous book by Ludwig Erhard. It was written in 1948. It's called Prosperity Through Competition. And this was his book that he wrote in defense of his program that he implemented in Germany after the war. I mean, this was an economy that was wrecked by inflation, by wartime planning, Nazism, by the whole social welfare state. I mean, it was just a complete disaster. All prices were controlled. But one of the things Nazism had done was institute vast numbers of business cartels, so that every sector of society had this kind of a cartel that was promised by the state, you will be the official producer of cars or the official producer of tires or whatever it may be. So the strongest resistance, and I didn't realize this until I read Erhard's book, the strongest resistance to his program of free markets was in fact the business class in Germany. And when you read his book, you know, it's not written to try to persuade poor people that they should like markets, or politicians even, or consumers, or anybody else. The whole thing is pitched towards business to try to convince them that a competitive market economy is in their long-term interest. So competition is something that it's one of these things that's in everybody's interest, but it's difficult to institute because the people who are on the top are always interested in shutting down competition and maintaining their position. Competition is a very difficult thing. I think, for example, of the fashion industry, you talk about a competitive market. You know, this is a market that has absolutely no patents or copyrights or anything like that out there. When the models hit the runways, everybody can copy, you know, the designs instantly. And so they've got to find ways to compete in this very, very rigorous, rivalrous sector. And it's an exciting place. an exciting place. It's a place of life and action. It's highly profitable. But we never want to believe that in any society, in any time, in any place, that we can do without competing, either as producers or as workers, actually. We're all competing with each other, in a sense. In the same firm, we're competing with our coworkers. We're cooperating with them on one hand. We're learning from them on one hand. On the other hand, we're also competing with them. So it's not just producers, and consumers compete, in a sense, with each other, too, and coworkers. It's just a way of trying to get better and better at what you do so that you can serve other people more efficiently. Competition is the way to reduce costs in society, and it's the path towards finding ever better ways, methods of production. So those three forces are what I see as the framework of the market economy. Cooperation, emulation, competition, all three equally important. And if we understand that, then I think, and we're speaking the same terms, then we can take on this whole moral critique of capitalism, which is vast. Do I have any questions so far about anything I've said? Okay. There's most of a review for you. I hope you got some insight. Yes, go ahead.
I would like to please explain a little bit more about what the point of view of intellectual property from capitalism.
Well, that's a fascinating topic, and you know what? I could talk about it for like 6 hours. Unfortunately, this is one of my obsessions lately. It's very dangerous for me to enter into that area because I'll talk about nothing else. And it's a difficult topic, but I think if you listened carefully to what I said about emulation, yeah, I'm definitely on the side of permitting free goods to remain free. Yeah. So to speak. Okay. So we can get to more of those issues maybe a little bit later. I would like to talk about it because there's a lot of confusion. But this is why I'm introducing this idea of copying really and learning and imitating at the outset, because I think it's an important. By the way, Mises talks about that too. He talks about free goods in society, and one of those free goods is the information we can extract, behaviors, anything that's free. All these things that are free we can copy, and essential to market success. Okay, I would like to bump past the main moral objections very quickly. The first, I don't know I was trying to think about what's the most common one. The most common one is, I suppose, inequality, and that the market leads to unequal results. And to me, it's a difficult thing for me to entirely understand this criticism because there's always one easy way to get rid of inequality, which is to make everybody equally poor or equally worse off. You can always bring about equality, I suppose, by destroying the well-being of some people, but it's no long-term solution, of course. Egalitarianism is generally a pernicious ideology. Sometimes I wonder where it comes from, and I think it must stem from an intuition, a moral intuition we all have, that in the eyes of God, we're all equally valuable, that every human person has an inherent value of, an infinite dignity, something like that. I think maybe that's where our moral intuition in favor of equality comes from. But you see, that's a very different thing from talking about equality of material condition. It's simply not possible to have such a thing as equality of material condition. I mean, for one thing, our subjective impressions of our material conditions are really very different. I mean, you could take everything I own and everything I am and just leave me with this suit, this collar, and this tie, and I'll be rather happy. And you could take somebody else in the room and do the same thing with them and dress them up just as me and stand them next to me. And my guess is that we won't have the same evaluation of our place in life. We can make us perfectly equal in every material respect, but there's still no way to compare. You might think yourself much worse off as a result than I do. I mean, there's simply no way to make interpersonal comparisons of subjective notions of how well off we are. I have friends of mine. I direct a choir, and one of the problems I have in my choir is that sometimes people, for a church actually, and the people sing in my choir and they get really inspired by religion, and some of them have left to go into monasteries and convents. It's a real problem. I tell everybody, my choir is a real problem. We keep losing people to the faith. It's terrible. But they go into these monasteries and they give up everything. They give up absolutely everything. And I can tell you it's not for me. I don't entirely understand this, really. I mean, I talk to them later. Well, they can't send email. You talk to them on the phone. They've got a new name. And they're absolutely penniless, and this is their choice. They're living in the dumpy little place and singing the Psalms all day, and I don't know. It's just and then you have to obey some guy all the time. It's this vow of obedience they take. Can you imagine a vow of obedience? Can you imagine? Again, it's not for me, but for them it makes them very happy. So it's like a vocation, like a calling, giving up everything. So how would you institute equality under those conditions? Let's say you had an ideal of equality. Well, everybody should be equal to everybody else in material condition. How are you going to deal with people who willingly give up all their property to undertake that kind of aesthetic life of prayer and contemplation? Extraordinary, isn't it? On the other hand, I have friends of mine who, tell me they can't sing in my choir because they're far too busy in their business, and they're very wealthy, and their time is enormously valuable. Giving up 2 hours on a Thursday night to come to choir practice for them is like giving up. The opportunity costs tens of thousands of dollars, and they just decline to do it. Well, that's their choice, too. So, and I wouldn't ever want to do anything to take away that right of them to make as much money as possible at the expense of singing Gregorian chant in my choir. So let's just throw the issue of inequality out. And we can discuss this a little bit later if you'd like to. The second one is, of course, greed. And I'm not going to dwell on that one because greed, of course, exists under all systems and all times and all places. I have a friend of mine from Uganda, and we were talking about how poor the country is. And he says, he told me, he said, Jeffrey, we've got a bigger problem. The biggest problem we have in Uganda is actually immorality. It's pervasive. And I said, well, what's the most immoral thing that people do? He said, well, people are enormously greedy. They will do anything for a buck. They'll do anything to get material goods. And he said, he was in the United States at the time, he said, that's one thing I love about the United States. You've solved in so many ways the problem of poverty. You have so much materially. It must be a marvelous thing to live in a society where people aren't constantly terribly greedy. Now, I'm not sure if he was right about that, but I was intrigued that he saw the origin of this sin as being poverty, whereas most intellectuals in this country see the origin of the sin of greed as wealth. But somehow wealth inspires people towards greed. Isn't that interesting? I thought it was a funny and interesting perspective. But I think what it shows is that, of course, human problems, like greed, if you want to call it a problem, can exist under any times and any places. It's a force in life like gravity. It doesn't really quite explain anything, really. It's pervasive, but it doesn't quite explain anything. The issue of discrimination now. I raised this topic because it's a big deal. Just recently, this guy, Rand Paul, is running for Senate somewhere, had stepped into it because he was hounded. They said, do you think it's okay for private businesses to discriminate based on race and fail to serve somebody just solely on grounds of race? And he was nervous to say what he should have said, which is that in a free society, of course, you should be free to discriminate too. He was afraid to say that because he was afraid what the consequences would be. And of course, on national television, you never have more than 10 seconds to make your point. Which, I wouldn't like that kind of setting either. But let me just say that on this topic of discrimination, I would like to get rid of the word completely, because discrimination is something that is all pervasive, that we can't help but do with every single behavior, every single action in all of our lives. I mean, we're discriminating against every other conference, every other activity you could possibly undertake just by being in this room. This is an act of discrimination. You're choosing to listen to me rather than be over at the Starbucks. That's the discrimination against Starbucks. So, I mean, anytime you face rivalrous choices in life, you necessarily have to discriminate. Now, of course, when the word is used in our popular context today, what they're really talking about is what's considered invidious discrimination, arbitrary discrimination against people on grounds of race, sex. The problem with rules that ban this sort of thing is that they presume that the rule maker and the rule enforcer is capable of reading minds, discerning always the motivation of the property owner. Do you see what I mean? That the presumption is that we know that the reason you didn't serve this person was because of race, was because of sex, was because of some other reason like that. And it's very presumptuous for a law to suppose that it can crawl into somebody's head and discern motivations like that. I think it's actually a totalitarian, a very dangerous practice. So the answer is that under freedom, yes, everybody's free to discriminate, and you're free to make mistakes, and you must pay for those mistakes. My daughter has a friend of hers who's constantly confessing about the plight of women in Auburn, Alabama. She says that women all over town are paid less than they should be compared to their productivity. They're more productive than men, and yet they're paid far less. And my daughter said to her, it sounds like you have a marvelous business opportunity sitting right here. I mean, you open up a business, hire all these highly productive, underpaid people, pay them what they're worth, and you will be able to outcompete everybody. I mean, that's a fantastic business idea. Why not go for it? And the girl didn't entirely understand. Of course, my daughter's well-trained in economics, and she could immediately see the error there. The point is that the market naturally weeds out bad choices over time, whether it's in the labor market or in the producer market or in the consumer market or anything else. So if you have some invidious discrimination, again, the person who's undertaking that discrimination is naturally going to pay. And by the way, markets are, in that sense, the least discriminatory for arbitrary reasons. Markets are constantly bringing people together, regardless of race and sex and class. And in fact, anybody who believes in an ideology that puts blood first, like Nazism or race or sex or any other condition of humanity, and wants to make it a central social principle, they really tend to loathe the commercial sector, because the commercial sector is always breaking down divisions between people. It's always been true. It's been true throughout all of history. So in that sense, the market is the least discriminatory institution. But as I say, I think the word is very misleading. Let me move on now to the whole question of fair trade products. Now I want to get down to specifics. We've only got a few minutes left in this lecture, as I understand it. Or do I have an hour? I have an hour. Okay, great. So we've got a series of specific subjects. The whole question of free trade coffee always amazes me because we're always constantly being hectored to buy this brand of coffee rather than that brand of coffee. Does that happen to you people? What kind of coffee are you drinking, and you measure your degree of virtue based on things like this? Well, it's very strange to me because you have to ask yourself, how do you obtain the fair trade designation? How do you become a fair trade coffee? It's granted by an institution, of course, but the idea is that the coffee plantation is paying very high wages and giving very high benefits, and this is considered to be socially just. Well, the companies that are most likely to pay the highest benefits and the highest wages and give their workers the most amenities tend to be the largest, most corporatized, largest plantations in existence, because they're the ones that can afford to do all these things. The smaller family plantations, smaller family farms, they have to pay much lower wages since they can't offer their employees much benefit. They tend to hire poorer people and give people opportunity in life. They are not regarded as suitably socially just. So it's very strange to me that you have suddenly these sort of left-wing socialist activists or whatever agitating always that you only buy coffee produced by the largest possible corporate conglomerate coffee plantations, and that you discriminate against, that you fail to buy coffee from small family-owned plantations that tend to hire poor people that are just getting going. I mean, it's a perversity, and I think the only way really to account for it is that the people who are agitating for these things don't really understand economics. I don't know how else to explain it. 'Cause every time I've ever known anybody who's on one of these fair trade campaigns that I've talked to about the subject, they eventually come around and go, yeah, now that you mention it, that is rather ridiculous, isn't it? You know. So, and I would say similarly the same thing about boycotts. Through every college campus, there's sweeps, periodic movements that you should boycott, whatever, Jack in the Box hamburger joint because they're using tomatoes produced at a certain plantation or a certain farm or a certain plot of land that's not paying their workers well enough. Well, I don't understand how it is that failing to buy tomatoes from that particular company is going to cause the workers to be better off as a result. In fact, it's going to do exactly the opposite. So there's no morality really in that. I mean, if you want the workers to be paid better, you want the company to grow, to be in a position to be able to pay them better, and the best way to do that is by buying the tomatoes. So, I mean, I think what you have ultimately among these people who agitate for these kind of campaigns is a sort of anti-commercial attitude. So let me back up just a little bit when I'm talking about this anti-commercial attitude. Something happens to the moral intuition on markets once you introduce the idea of money. And I find it really interesting because, at the beginning I laid out this model, competition or cooperation, emulation, competition as the social forces. And most people accept that and understand it until you monetize it or introduce money into the equation. Then somehow that's perceived to be some kind of evil thing taking place. It's like the whole subject of money kind of drives people crazy. Like they're not able to think about commerce the same way. If all of society consisted in sort of barter, maybe the people wouldn't have a moral objection to it. But you introduce money, people get very confused. And I would say that money is the top topic in economics that almost everybody is confused about. So I was so grateful for Larry Reed's lecture that he gave at my college when I was so young to help clarify the nature of money, just to understand that money is nothing other than a good for facilitating exchange. And that's all it is. It's nothing magical or anything else. It's just a proxy for the goods and services that it can buy. And it makes things easier, more convenient for us. If you understand that, then you take away the mystery of money. Then I think it helps to see things a little bit more clearly. An example of that, I'd like to draw attention to the subject of organ transplants, for example. Now, this is an interesting one because you know that we're not permitted to have market exchange for things like kidneys, right? So people all over the country are suffering, desperate for kidney transplants and can't get them because we insist that people just donate these rather than buy and sell them. That's a little bit of a puzzle to me because really I don't see why money should change the moral equation at all. Just because you're exchanging money, I don't know why that would change anything. I mean, I asked a coworker the other day she was intuitively against it. She said, you can't have a market for organs. That's just disgusting. That's commodifying the human body. We'll talk about that. So I said, well, let me just think about this. Let's say I know that you need a kidney, and I've just taken a great love for you in some ways in your well-being, and so I give up one of mine. You would be happy about that. And you regard that as a great gift, right? And she said, well, yes, that would be a great, wonderful sacrifice, and yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful thing. I said, well, what if you paid me for the same thing? You paid me a few $100 in exchange for that. Wouldn't you still have the kidney and be better off? And wouldn't I still gain the benefit of having known that I made a sacrifice for you? She couldn't quite solve it. And it was interesting because it was like the introduction of money into it confused everything for her, We ran an article some years ago on this topic on Mises.org, on our website, on the topic of markets for organs. And, hardly a week has gone by since that day. And by the way, we weren't starting a market for kidneys. We were just writing an article supporting the idea, right? But for whatever reason, now hardly a week goes by where we don't get calls and emails of people offering to sell their body parts. People looking for people who are selling their body parts. It's true. emails all the time. In fact, I had to put up at the top of the article, this is not a service for us buying and selling kidneys. It's just an article about the topic, all right? But it tells me that there's a huge demand out there. Anytime government suppresses a market, says, no, this can't be part of monetary exchange, then it's going to create a black market. There must be an immense black market out there is all I can say on the subject. Okay, on the subject of, let's move on to the subject of asymmetric information as another issue. By asymmetric information, what I mean is that buyer and seller have different levels of knowledge about the deal they're getting into. By this, I don't mean fraud. For example, if I sell you my 1985 Buick and claim that it's a 1989 Buick, that would be fraud, right? But if I sell you my 1985 Buick and I know that this particular model is something of a lemon, or that it's really driving this car. This car is very low, so it will give you a very low social status, something like that. And the buyer thinks that it gives them a high social status, or that this is a great car, or whatever. Now, is that immoral? St. Thomas actually deals with this topic, St. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica. And the question comes up that you've got a water dealer in the desert, and he's selling water at a very high price. And he comes across a caravan of people who are very thirsty. Now, he knows a mile behind him there's many other water dealers that are going to be selling water. And he has just a little bit. He offers a very, very high price for it, knowing full well that if they would just waited an hour, they would be able to buy the water at a much lower price. And so the question is asked to St. Thomas, is he morally obligated to tell the buyers of the water that there's a caravan just a mile down the road that can sell water much cheaper? And his answer was absolutely not. He's not obligated at all. He's only obligated to give a good description of his product and arrive at a price that's amenable to both sides. It's very interesting, isn't it? I often think about the issue of asymmetric information in light of the parable in the Bible where, do you remember this parable? So a guy has like a house and he's got a field in the backyard or something, and for whatever reason there's a treasure buried there. You know the story? You don't know the story? Okay, the treasure in the field. So some other guy, I guess he's been passing by or he heard rumor on the street or whatever that there's a treasure in the field. So he goes up to the owner, and he has every intention of buying the house and the land and everything just so he can get the treasure in the field. He knocks on the door and he says, I've been thinking, I might like this land and this house. There's nothing really great about it, but I wonder if you'd sell it to me for a certain amount. And the guy says, well, nobody's ever offered me money before. This is kind of a dumpy place. I'm sick of it. So he sells it. And the new guy moves in, and he's able to get the treasure. Never tells the seller that there's a treasure in his field. He doesn't know it. The buyer knows it, but the seller doesn't know it. Now, Jesus is reporting this story, and at no point in Jesus' telling of the story does he say something like, don't you think it's rotten that the guy who bought the field didn't tell the owner that he never says anything like that at all. He presents it as a fantastic example of entrepreneurship, really. One person knew something and the other person didn't know it. So he bought the house, he got the treasure, and he was infinitely more well off. So it's a case of asymmetric information at work. Nothing at all wrong with it in Jesus' view and St. Thomas's view. And in my own view, asymmetric information is just simply part of market exchange. And you remember when we talked about market exchange earlier, about when I bought the rolls at the store and exchanged the money? Now, you could say that in every market exchange, there's some degree of asymmetric information in the sense that we're both bringing different values to the transaction. Now, I know absolutely that these rolls are more valuable than the $2 I'm going to spend on them. I'm certain of this. And I can try to persuade her, don't you see that these rolls are more valuable than the $2 I'm going to spend on them, or else I wouldn't engage in this exchange? And she would just fire back at me. Well, that's completely wrong. Actually, in fact, your $2 is more valuable than the rolls I'm going to give up. And we would just simply argue. This is a case of asymmetric information. Do you see what I mean? We have different value systems. So asymmetric information, different levels of knowledge, different understandings of what's taking place, is inherent in the whole market process. Every single exchange in the market is governed by asymmetric information. You agree with that, Paul? Okay. I just have to check myself, Okay. The infallible Paul Swick, right. Okay. Now let me say, the last thing on my list here of specific moral challenges is the issue. I put it down because, not because it's going to make any sense to you and it doesn't make any sense to me, but because it's so pervasive. And it's the whole subject of war. For some reason, people associate war and the market. I think probably Lenin was one of the first people to do this. He said the inherent part of the capitalist economy is this desire for conquest and imperialism. I don't know what to say other than, yes, war is very wrong. It's very immoral. And conquest is immoral, and imperialism is usually a very terrible idea. But these are not part of the structure of the market economy. So it doesn't make any sense to critique capitalism for warmongering, because warmongering isn't really part of the capitalist apparatus. And I would suggest to you, in fact, that most moral critiques of the market are not really critiquing the market. They're critiquing something else. And we've seen this very recently in the whole economic bust. AIG was bailed out, and people said, well, there you go, that's capitalism. Well, it's not capitalism. That's, I don't know what you call it, fascism, socialism, call it something else. But it's not part of the market economy. It's the same thing with all these bailouts. This is not really capitalism at work. It's something else. Okay, we've got now a few minutes for questions, I believe. Well, actually, before we do that, let me just end up something that's extremely important, because this is a subject that, for some reason, people outside of economics, and even within economics, just don't want to think about. And it's good for you, whenever you're talking to a philosopher or a literary critic or a sociologist or just any person about this subject. Anytime somebody is ready to make a critique against the market and suggest some other alternative, remind them that there's only one alternative to the market, and that is the state. It's coercion, it's imposition, it's aggression. As Mises said, it's hanging, it's killing, it's always violence. Those are the only two real ways that we have in society of dealing with any social problem at all. We can either do it voluntarily through market exchange or through the state. And it's a subject, oddly, that is avoided. It's a reality that is avoided in almost every discipline that you'll ever encounter. I just had a philosopher over the house the other night, and she was just we were talking about a whole variety of social subjects, and she was always sort of speculating, well, shouldn't we have a system whereby, and then fill in the blank? And she would say this. And I would always have to ask the question, how is this going to be instituted, and who's going to enforce it? And doesn't that mean investigations and police powers and people breaking down your door and jails and these sorts of things? And it would always startle her. Like, I don't really mean that. I just mean like a rule, some kind of rule. Well, who's going to enforce this rule? Is it a rule that we voluntarily keep, like I do in my subdivision? I agree not to paint my door orange? That kind of rule? No. I mean, it's all over society a rule. Well, then don't we need the state? I mean, isn't that dangerous, actually? And they're always startled. It's like they don't really want to talk about it. People want to talk about social affairs as if they're completely unhinged from two things: economic considerations and the reality of the state. And I'm telling you, you can't really talk about any aspect of society at all without an understanding of economic considerations, economic law, economic logic, and without the reality that any alternative to the market will always and everywhere involve the state. So always keep that in mind. One of the best books I've ever read on this subject is actually by Frank Chodoroff. It's called The Rise and Decline of Society, where he really hammers this point home. It's an impossible thing to forget. And since I've brought up jail and also the subject of commodification, let me say something about this. Larry and I were talking earlier. When we both went to Nicaragua, we were detained. It was really an interesting case. Because he had taken a picture of the Interior Ministry or something, and so the police came and detained us and destroyed our pictures, whatever. And Larry said that he's the only person who's been arrested with Jeffrey Tucker, this remains true, but it's also true that since that time, and he didn't know this, I was arrested myself for failing to pay a traffic ticket. It wasn't really quite a traffic ticket. I rolled through a stop sign. Now, look, it's a stop sign in a subdivision. How harmless is that, right? What is that? That's nothing. I mean, surely we all agree we need stop signs. Okay, maybe we do. But always remember that any time you have a law, it will always be enforced by jails and coercion. Always remember that. This came home to me, very much so. Now, this is stop sign right outside of my house, and I just kind of, I didn't roll through, I didn't run the stop sign. I just kind of stopped, and my tires didn't do that rollback thing, and you're supposed to count to 5 or whatever the thing is, So I kind of, and I went forward, and that was it. And the policeman comes after me, and come on. How can you make me? This is ridiculous. This is like a 3-way stop. The other side is the swimming pool or something. This is not, Well, he gives me a ticket anyway. They're trying to raise money. Well, I was so disgusted by this, I guess. I just had some sense that, so annoyed by it that when the court summons to make me appear, came in the mail or something, it got lost with the junk mail or something. But I was sitting at home with my family, and there's a knock at the door. This is a Sunday brunch. I knock at the door, and there's a policeman there with a picture of me, a warrant for my arrest, and my head on it, and I'm staring. So, he comes out. At first, of course, nice to him. I'm like one of those guys you see on YouTube. You see, these movies with people being arrested, they're first nice. Well, it was nice to him, trying to butter him up, but, well, he was going to arrest me. So handcuffs me, and so then I start getting annoyed and insulting him about his job, and don't you have anything better to do with your life, This should have been on YouTube, right? So then he drags me out into his car, stuffs me into the car, takes me off to jail. They photograph me, put me in crazy suit, and throw me in prison. I'm in prison. But I'm sort of glad I went through it, actually, because I didn't entirely understand something about the state. Well, there's a number of things I learned. I knew intellectually, this is a true experience, something as innocent seeming as the stop sign in the subdivision ultimately is always enforced with jails. And if I had resisted arrest, what would have happened to me? They could have shot me, really. I mean, that's a scary thing. Anytime you give the state power, it must be enforced. Sometimes, maybe you think it's necessary, Maybe that's you want to pay that price. Okay, but remember what the price is, that ultimately every law is enforced in just this way. Another thing I discovered in jail, my life in jail. Yes, I learned a lot in my prison years. So, you're completely under their control. They take away your watch and your cell phone, and without time and a means of communication, you have no sense of the passage of time. You have no way to contact anybody. Wow, it's almost metaphysically transforming. I mean, you're kind of just standing there, confused about who you are and where you are and what's going on. What's happening? You have no control. And everybody who does control your life, you know what? They don't really care about you at all. At all. I mean, I asked the lady, shouting through the bars, hey, could you tell me what time it is? And she looked at me like I was like just like bones and skin guy making noise over there. Like, what's that noise coming from over there? Looked straight at me, but kind of almost looked through me. I said, look, I'm a human being of value and dignity. Oh, right. And so then I noticed in my cell there's a phone, And I thought, oh, it's like in the movies, you get a phone call. Okay, that's what I'm going to do, make a phone call. So I picked up the phone. Well, it was kind of like old phone where you had to put in money. Well, I didn't have any money. So, and I couldn't remember everybody's numbers anymore, because our cell phones all have names, So, and then it turned out you can't call cell phones from this phone on the wall because you can only call landlines. And you can only call collect. They still have this thing. I guess there's like 2 or 3 operators that still say, collect call from, I don't know. But anyway, I couldn't make. I tried making a phone call, and I noticed I kept turning around, and all my fellow inmates, all very charming people, got to know them very well, started. They were laughing at me because they knew that the phone doesn't work, And some guy kept saying, "Listen, buddy, you're in jail. The phone doesn't work in jail." But he was very animated, and very loud when he said this. And he was screaming at me. And the crumbs from his sandwich that he was eating were flying at me as he was yelling. Well, let me just say this about, I think about this all the time when people talk about, well, the market is terrible. It commodifies everything. We're commodifying people. Well, it's ridiculous. First of all, the market doesn't commodify people. It commodifies people's services. That is a beautiful thing, really, because when something is a commodity, that means it is valuable. Hardly anybody talks about the nightmare, the metaphysical horror of complete decommodification. Decommodification, right? That means to remove the value completely from something so that it's zero value or it's negative value. To be completely decommodified is what it's like to be in jail. You would rather be an animal in a zoo where people take care of you and stroke your back and give you fish or whatever the thing is. You'd rather be a pet in somebody's house where you kind of sleep in a nice little dog house or something like that, or a fish in somebody's fish tank where they're cleaning the water for you, throwing you fish flakes. To be in jail, to be under the control of the state completely, is to have all value robbed from you, totally and completely. It changes you completely. Now, I submit to you that is what it is like for every single person who lives in a socialist society. A socialist society is a society completely in jail, where there is no value attached to anyone at all. A completely decommodified society, where everything is decommodified. That is the worst nightmare that you can ever imagine. So when people talk about commodification, I'm tempted to say, God bless it. God bless commodification. My services are valued. My property is valued. I have some control over my life. I can surround myself by people who appreciate me. Do you know what that means? That's everything. That's everything. To be able to trade, to be able to increase value, to be able to make value through entrepreneurship and enterprise, to have the freedom to do these things, that's life. That's the essence of life. That's the way you build civilization. The alternative is a nightmare. The worst nightmare of all. Okay, I'll stop there and take any questions on anything I've said so far. And I'm going to continue the discussion, I think, after the break, where we're going to go through a series of criticisms of the market that come not from the left, but from the right. So that should be fun. Is there time for question and answers? Go ahead. Yeah, here. Okay. Oh, there's a microphone thing. Oh, okay. Good.
I know your first, one of the first things you mentioned was inequality and how people not in favor of the market say, oh, that's a problem with it. But and this is a fairly common, to a lot, but basically a lot of people that I talk to on the left say that, sure, we don't need necessarily everyone to be equal, but everyone should have, everyone has certain rights to education or service X, Y, or Z. And so a little.
Yeah, I think sometimes market advocates have made a mistake in embracing this notion of equality of, well, you've heard it before. I don't favor equality of result, I favor equality of opportunity. Well, I don't see how you can favor equality of opportunity either. I mean, there's no chance for that whatsoever. There's no such thing as equality of opportunity. I mean, you'll never get it. You could strive forever. It's impossible to achieve something like equality of opportunity. So I would really encourage all of you to reject that phrase as well. It's actually very dangerous. We all have different opportunities because we all live different lives. It's not possible to equalize even that, really. You mentioned education in particular. I'm always puzzled by this subject because people are very concerned about offering everybody an education. Well, there's a lot to say about this subject, but if something is as valued throughout society as education, That's a pretty good candidate for entrepreneurship and for enterprise and for markets to handle. Something as valuable as education, everybody agrees is valuable. Something that everybody agrees is valuable, the market will certainly provide, almost by definition, because everybody agrees it's valuable. So it's a perfect candidate for the market. The idea that we ever introduced the state into education strikes me as just incredibly implausible. And I don't understand many aspects of the way we think about education today. For example, in my town, the property taxes that are associated with living in neighborhoods where people go to the right schools, where the houses are priced far higher than they would be if they were outside of that school district. If you add the taxes together with the very high prices of the homes, you come up with figures that far exceed the annual price of private schools in the community. I don't understand this. I mean, we're paying vastly more for public education. Even individuals are paying vastly more for public education than they ever would for private education. So it's a very messed up system. I also don't understand this mentality that it's a matter of human right that we should have a zero-priced education between first grade and your senior year in high school. And at that point, you should be willing to spend up to $50,000 a year for college education, and nobody objects to that. Isn't that strange? I mean, you can't believe what people pay for. Well, I guess you can. It's an incredible thing. So it's a matter of human rights that there should be zero price for education up to 12th grade, but the 13th year of education can cost as much as $50,000, $100,000 a year. And that's just intrinsic as a matter of morality. Ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I like the idea that education would be a market good like any other. It could be zero priced. We don't know. In the end, I mean, who believed that you could read the New York Times for free, like I do every single day online, or get all the benefits of a Google search engine for absolutely nothing? I mean, if I were speculating how the World Wide Web market would work, I never would have anticipated that most everything would be absolutely zero priced. And how does that happen? Well, it's complicated. Maybe you all know the answer here, but these are the things you can't always anticipate. So maybe in a free market for education, there wouldn't be any cost for education. We don't know. We don't know what would result. But most likely there'd be a whole range of educational services available, just like there are a range of services available in every sector where there's a vibrant market for anything, like shoes or whatever. So, yeah, I'll stop there with that question. Yes, Larry?
Jeff, let me just add a comment. I don't really have a question, but your point is superb about the cost of public education. But let me also point out that with public education, you pay not just during the time that your child is in the school, you pay for a lifetime. And if you never have children, you pay for a lifetime. Whereas with private school, you pay while your kid's there. They don't send you the bill for the next 60 years.
Right. Yeah. And, you draw attention to these kinds of points, and really people will quite frequently say, well, that's a good point. We really shouldn't have people without children paying for public schools. Well, once you start exempting people, the schools aren't public anymore, right? I mean, they just become basically a fee for service, and that's what the market essentially boils down to. So, I'm in favor of exempting anybody who doesn't have. Why should they have to pay? Of course, the idea is that there's these wonderful externalities that come from getting everybody educated, and these are very difficult times for young people right now. Many friends of mine have done everything according to the rules. Stayed in school, got the top grades, gone into hard sciences or difficult subjects, and gotten honors after honors after honors, and their resumes look beautiful. And guess what? They're unemployed now. I don't know. Maybe you have friends in this kind of situation. Many friends of mine are in this kind of situation. They're sitting on more than $100,000 in student debt, fabulous credentials, and absolutely no employment opportunities whatsoever. It's a very dangerous situation for the generation that's just graduated because they can't really accept a job over at Starbucks or Walmart or whatever like they should. They should do that. They can't, because what happens? There's student loans. They have to start paying those right away. They have to stay in school to keep putting off the date at which they start paying the loans. This is what accounts for the level of unemployment among new graduates, which is like 20, 25, some estimates put it as high as 30% today. In all fields. You know, I just talked to a person the other day who just graduated with an MBA from Master's in Business Administration from Columbia. Unemployed. You know, another friend of mine is aerospace engineering, 4.0. Everything you can imagine, every benefit you can imagine, unemployed. And they're all panicked, mainly because of the student loan problem. And also there's a real issue, I think, these days with people who had a built-in certain set of expectations about what society owed them because they did everything right, stayed in school, got top grades, and now society is not coughing up, and it's very difficult to make that adjustment. In other words, it's not always the case. It's not inevitable that school and staying in school as long as possible is going to fix you up for life. It's not necessarily true at all. Even employers now are wondering about students who stay in school forever and ever and haven't done anything other than that. So I would urge all of you to, whenever you find work opportunities while you're in school, to always seize on them as much as possible and pack your resumes with your job experience. And fortunately, in the age of digital media, there's lots of things you can do just from your home or your desktop, and that's very much to be encouraged. And if the idea is just to make sure that as many people as possible get high credentials and everything, I think what we probably ought to do, rather than spending all this money, extracting all these resources, we should just give everybody a PhD at birth, you know, and then just be done with it, you know, and then otherwise just turn it over to the market. Okay, it is now, I guess, kind of late, but is there another question before we finish this session? I can't believe that nobody was horrified by anything I said. Yes, go ahead. This is a woman with horror on her face.
This wasn't necessarily something you addressed, but it has to do with morality.
Yes.
What is the free market view on things like drugs or prostitution, which we have deemed immoral, but aren't necessarily in other countries?
Oh, we meaning Americans?
Yeah.
Western peoples or whatever?
Right.
Okay. Well, of course, I'm totally in favor of decriminalization of drugs completely on both utilitarian and natural rights grounds. I don't think that it's any business of the state what people ingest. And I tell you, I am really getting fed up with the system in this country. You know, I can't even buy Mucinex at the CVS without having, given my driver's license. The other day I went in and tried to get some Sudafed. It's just a drug. Bush decided people were making methamphetamine out of this thing, George Bush decided people were making methamphetamine out of this drug. So now, there's a quota on how many Sudafeds you can take, so I have to run around with a stuffy nose and, then I go to the CVS and I'm begging them and they think I'm a criminal or something. And if I complain about it, they're starting to people start gathering around me or whatever. At CVS just the other day, there's a big sign up, with a list with pictures, like headshots, of 18 people who were arrested recently for buying too much Sudafed. Because they were suspected of providing methamphetamine. Meanwhile, it turns out, since the whole crackdown on Sudafed came about, all the methamphetamine makers have figured out a way that you can make methamphetamine in your car using something like a bleach and like a flame or something at a stoplight. You shake it up. It sounds very dangerous to me. Whew. But the point is that they found the workaround. If you want methamphetamine, you're going to get it and do even more dangerous things for it. So, yeah, this whole drug war has really been catastrophic. And it's hurt all of us in this room. Oh, I take a little prescription thing to kind of settle me down a little bit. The small thing. I've had a tremor since I was 13 years old. My hand shakes a little bit. It's a pill about that big. And so I went in. And I said, look, I need to fill my prescription. I've been taking this stupid thing since I was like 13 years old. It's not a big deal. It's just nothing. Can you somehow arrange it so I don't have to come back like every month to fill this thing? Can you give it to me for, say, give me a 30-year prescription. How about that? Would that be possible? Just give me 30 years worth of this thing. And the lady said, no, I'm afraid that would not be possible. That's not right. I said, well, it's not dangerous. And she said, well, many drugs are dangerous. I said, but this one's not. It's just a dumb little thing. No, I'm sorry. You must come back every month. That's just the way it is. So, I mean, there are spillover effects. I'm sorry for the people who burn out their head, they fry their brains with drugs or whatever the heck the thing is, but, this drug war has really been enormously costly for all of society. It's been catastrophic. As for prostitution, let me just make a point. I don't know, I've got St. Thomas in my brain today. It's a very interesting thing because St. Thomas, I guess most people agree that he was kind of a serious moral thinker, right? So he was once asked the question about prostitution. Should it be stamped out? And he said, some evils should be permitted in society because the attempt to stamp them out will create an even greater evil. Do you remember where he said this? He writes this in the Summa. He said, if we stamp out, and it's puzzling that he would say, he said, if we stamped out prostitution, society would be consumed by lust. I'm just reporting what he said. But his point about greater evil is that, you get the state in the business of regulating human associations like that. And it's always dangerous. The market is far better at regulating those even morally ambiguous situations. It's far better to trust the market than the state in the case of the prostitution. So I would argue for the complete legalization of both drugs and all human associations, including prostitution. So, it's a funny thing. We all have to develop. Mises writes in Liberalism, his book, great book, Liberalism, 1929. He talks about pillars of free enterprise. He says property rights, yes. Freedom of association, yes. Peace, yes. But he also says tolerance. And for years, I didn't quite entirely understand what he meant by tolerance. But I think what he means is that if you favor freedom, you're going to have to learn to tolerate things you don't like. I once had a friend from Boston who came down. And I guess, is everybody in Boston this way? They're annoyed by everybody else's behaviors, and they think they should be running the world or something. And so he would sit on my front porch, and he would look at SUVs going by, and he'd condemn them. And he'd say, look at that guy in an SUV. Isn't that just disgusting? Not really. I don't know what. There's another one. Another disgusting, despicable SUV. Look at that guy just driving around an SUV. It's horrible. And so I can't understand. I mean, there's a profound intolerance here. Or people that are annoyed by advertising. Look, people that drive down the street and they see an ad and they say, oh, look at that horrible advertisement. Well, look, if you're going to live in a free society, you have to learn to kind of deal with things that annoy you a little bit. I remember once I was in a seminar with Karen Vaughn, who's an economist at George Mason University, and some left-wing socialist minister of some sort. And he was railing against the rich. He's just disgusted by the rich. They make him sick. The rich people just make him sick. Oh, but what are we going to do with rich people? They're just terrible rich people. He's going on and on. Karen finally just couldn't stand it anymore. And she said, well, you know what? The rich are great benefactors to society. They are the source of capital, and capital is essential to a growing economy and essential to sustaining our population. And I would suggest to you that even if you don't like them, you learn to tolerate them, just aesthetically, morally. Learn to tolerate the rich, because they are helping everyone. They're helping the poor, they're helping the middle class, they're helping everybody. The rich are bringing medical care to those who need it. They are bringing education. They are the people who fund our culture, our churches, our symphonies, our civic clubs, our associations, things like the Foundation for Economic Education, and every other nonprofit. The rich are great benefactors to society. So I can't control what your attitudes are inside, but I would suggest to you that you just develop a little more tolerance towards them. And I think we all have to feel that way a little bit more. There are things about the world that annoy all of us. But we have to ask ourselves, is this something that is part of the structure of freedom? In which case, we might just need to learn to deal with it a little bit better than we do. That's what I would suggest about prostitution and about drugs and rich and other hated institutions like that. Yeah. Okay, anybody else? This is fun. I enjoyed these questions and answers. Okay, we'll be back shortly.